I'll just start with the introductions. My name is Michael Khambatta. I'm the Geneva representative from the Gulf Center for Human Rights, based in Geneva. And first of all, welcome to everybody here. Thank you very much for taking the time to come. We have three speakers who are going to speak today to the issues in Saudi Arabia and give us a bit of an update and tracking on progress or the lack thereof on human rights. I just want to say that part of the initiative of this comes out of a report that was submitted to the UPR process, and it was a joint submission by ALQST, Martin Ennals, and the Gulf Center. And the idea was that we provide a submission to the midterm report, which is not normally the place where NGOs submit, but we thought it was a timely thing to do, and we made that submission. And Joshua is going to speak to some of the highlights of that. That's the first speaker. The second speaker is going to be Ms. Alhathloul, who will speak a little bit to the personal price paid by her family, by Loujain, who is still in Saudi Arabia, and then at the end, Dana Ahmed will give us a bit more of an updated picture, perhaps looking at what's happened recently, especially given that Amnesty International has reported on that. So what we are hoping is that this will provide some sort of impetus to move action forward in March. There's a history of joint statements that have been held in previous sessions, and it's good to see some of the states who authored those present today. There's been 2 sessions. This will be the third that there has been no joint statement, and we would very much like to see what can be envisaged and what might be possible for the next session in March. So I'm going to hand it over to Joshua, and I'm hoping that everybody will keep to 8 to 10 minutes, and I'll switch off my camera.
Great, thanks very much for the introduction, Michael. And as you mentioned, I'll be talking today about Saudi Arabia's Universal Periodic Review, or UPR process, which by nature involves taking stock of the authorities' progress or lack of. It's particularly relevant now, as you mentioned, as we're now midway through Saudi Arabia's current cycle, with its last UPR adopted in 2018 and the next one due in 2023. During the midterm reporting period over the summer, several reports were submitted by NGOs, including one by ALQST, Gulf Center for Human Rights, and the Martin Ennals Foundation, which I'll mostly be referring to today and will be publishing after the event. The report points to a shocking lack of progress made so far, including in terms of a failure to implement recommendations accepted and continued violations on the grounds, both of which reflect the authorities' lack of will to genuinely improve the human rights situation, and should serve as a wake-up call for the international community to do more to ensure that the Saudi authorities put the commitments they have made into action. Firstly, just to recap, it was back in November 2018 that the UPR Working Group conducted its 3rd periodic review of the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia. The adopted report contained a total of 258 recommendations on a wide range of human rights issues, and at the following Human Rights Council session in March 2019, the Saudi authorities presented their response, in which they surprisingly accepted, at least in part, the vast majority of the recommendations, 186. They also noted or rejected 72, which did include a number of key recommendations, often those which are more specific or time-bound, but overall, the Saudi authorities partially accepted a large number of recommendations, which, if fully implemented, would significantly improve the human rights situation in the country. We're just over halfway into the UPR cycle, so where does Saudi Arabia stand now? I won't go into too much detail, but we'll highlight some of the main themes included in the report from ALQST, the Gulf Center, and Martin Ennals Foundation. I'll start with one of the most apparent contradictions. Saudi Arabia accepted the vast majority of recommendations, calling on the state to protect the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly, and release those detained for exercising these rights, although it did also reject a more pressing one from Germany calling for the immediate release of human rights offenders. Yet, as we know, the Saudi authorities continue to detain scores of prisoners of conscience, including human rights defenders, journalists, clerics, writers, and those released including women human rights offenders in 2019 and this year, continue to face harsh restrictions and are unable to speak out, going against recommendation accepted from Canada to foster an environment which is conducive to open debate. Meanwhile, in an unrelenting crackdown on free speech, the Saudi authorities have carried out more arbitrary arrests, often in waves, including in April 2019 of writers and May 2021, and they have sentenced many rights activists and peaceful critics to lengthy prison sentences following unfair trials and invoking repressive counterterrorism and cybercrime laws, such as in the trial of Loujain Alhathloul and several this year alone, including Abdulrahman al-Sattan and Mohammed al-Rabia. This is all in flagrant disregard of several recommendations made, including to revise legislation and to ensure the necessary independence of the judiciary. Likewise, no progress on recommendations accepted to ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and on economic, social, and cultural rights has been made, making Saudi Arabia one of the few countries not to be a party. Meanwhile, other recommendations like ratifying the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture were rejected. Similarly, on UN engagement, despite accepting recommendation to intensify cooperation with special procedure mandate holders, there have been no signs of responding to over a dozen pending visits made by special procedure mandate holders to Saudi Arabia, and Saudi Arabia tellingly rejected a more specific recommendation from Greece to set a date for a visit by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights offenders. In addition, despite accepting recommendations to take steps to prevent torture, cruel and degrading treatment in prisons, the use of torture and ill treatment continues, including many examples of deliberate medical neglect, including the cases of Mohammed al-Khudri, Salman al-Auda, Mohammed al-Qahtani, and the death in detention last year of Abdullah al-Hamid. Investigations are seldom conducted into torture allegations, as was clear in Loujain's trial, despite partially accepting a recommendation from New Zealand to investigate all instances of torture. And coerced confessions are still routinely admitted as evidence in court, such as in the trial of Abdulrahman al-Sattan, whose verdict of 20 years for his peaceful expression on social media was just upheld today. Unsurprisingly, there were a large number of recommendations relating to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Saudi Arabia did accept a large number of recommendations, including calling on the state to clarify the circumstances of the killing, ensure full accountability of those responsible, and to disclose all information available, which is particularly a flagrant failure, given they've still refused to reveal the whereabouts of the body, for example. And although the authorities would say there has been accountability and point to the domestic trial in Saudi Arabia, which prosecuted 11 unidentified people, the trial has lacked any transparency. On the issue of the death penalty, only 1 out of 23 UPR recommendations were supported by Saudi Arabia, indicating a continued firm stance on the matter. There have been some announced reforms since, including a supposed moratorium on the death penalty for drug-related offences, although this law has not been published, and a promise to end the execution of child defendants, but the related royal decree contains significant loopholes, including excluding those tried under the counter-terrorism law, as was the case for Mustafa al-Dawish, who was executed in June for alleged crimes committed when 17, and those under qisas or hudud crimes, such as Abdullah al-Hawaiti, who is currently on death row. And evidence of the limitations on reform related to the death penalty is also highlighted by the reality on the ground. For instance, the number of executions in 2021 is already more than double the number for the whole of 2020. And lastly, on women's rights, Saudi Arabia did accept several recommendations to promote women's rights and gender equality, although some of the recommendations use quite vague language. There have been a number of reforms to improve the situation for women, including allowing women to obtain passports and travel, and as well as question marks around the implementation of these reforms. There are other aspects of the male guardianship system which remain intact, such as relating to education, employment, health, marriage, and nationality. And this is in clear contradiction to a recommendation by Iceland that was accepted by Saudi Arabia, which mentioned these rights, education, employment, marriage specifically. So just to recap, we are now just over midway through Saudi Arabia's cycle, and this report and others highlight a clear lack of progress made so far in terms of implementing the recommendations accepted, as well as carrying out further violations on the grounds which flagrantly contradict the spirit and essence of the recommendations accepted, both of which highlight the authorities' lack of will to generally improve the human rights situation, and as mentioned before, should serve as a wake-up call for the international community to do more to ensure the Saudi authorities put the commitments they made ahead of the next UPR in 2023 into action. And I would say that member states do and can have an impact given Saudi Arabia's susceptibility to international pressure, but we've seen that the UPR process alone and concessions made back in 2018 do not necessarily snowball into improve human rights situation, and member states need to actively follow up on commitments made as well as those rejected with coordinated action, such as the establishment of a UN monitoring and reporting mechanism. And given the pace of violations, and in this year alone, which other speakers will expand upon, this really needs to come as soon as possible, i.e. at the next Human Rights Council session in March 2022. So look forward to discussing this further, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Josh, for outlining that you had quite a challenge. It was a very dense 16-page report that was produced, and we would be happy to share that with anyone. We had expected that it might be put up on the GCHR website in the UPR section, but my understanding is that that those reports are not yet up. So, but we consider the report public and are happy to share that. So, thank you very much, Josh. I'm going to pass it now over to Lina Alhathloul, who I think can give us a human dimension to the problems that are suffered. It's very easy to talk about reports and recommendations, but it touches real people, and I hope that Lina can give us some insight into that. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. So yes, my name is Lina. I'm the sister of Loujain Alhathloul, who's a Saudi activist detained from 2018 till recently. In February, she was released. I've talked a lot about her arrest, her case, prisoners of conscience, but I think today I will really concentrate on travel bans for different reasons, because I think we don't talk about it, and I don't think people really understand that it's the first step for more violations, and that it really makes people live under fear in Saudi Arabia. So it's when my sister Loujain first got arrested, she was kidnapped from the Emirates, flown back to Saudi Arabia, and then put on under a travel ban in Saudi Arabia, so she couldn't leave it. And not only did they put my sister under a travel ban, but my whole family as well. So when we found out that my family was under a travel ban, we the family abroad refused to go back, because we knew that this was our faith also. So they put people under a travel ban illegally, unofficially, and without even being able to tell us where the decision comes from. And the thing is, it's really, really scary, because we know how the Saudis operate, and their modus operandi is usually putting people under a travel ban and then arresting them sometime later. This is what they did to Loujain and to many other activists. But now under MBS, it's collective punishments. So they do this to activists, but they also threaten the families, saying you should be silent, and if you talk about anything, you're next. So really, families have a sword of Damocles hanging over their head. They cannot talk about what is going on to activists, and they live in an atmosphere of fear. But more than this, it's not only about them, it's also about the fact that it isolates them in society. So for example, many people, even within, my extensive family, they're not willing to talk to my parents anymore because they're scared that they will be next, that they would also be under a travel ban. So we really see that these travel bans are the first steps for more violations, that they make people live under fear, and that they're the reason why nobody hears about what is going on to prisoners of conscience, because they're just scared they might be next. So if we lift these bans, it's, I think, the first step for families to be less scared to speak about what is going on inside of the country. If we lift these travel bans, I think that also people are willing to go and come. Like for me, I would go to Saudi Arabia. I would really see what is going inside of the country, and it also would give some fresh air to the country. So I think we should really emphasize on this. So my recommendation is that we should not underestimate the harm it causes to families and to detainees. And second, I think we should put it as an equal priority as the demand of releasing prisoners of conscience, and making it publicly also, because I've been repeating this for years now, is that Saudi Arabia cares about its image. All they do is only for their reputation, and when they see that the West and that activists abroad and that organizations know about what is going on in the country, and that they're pointed at, and these violations are highlighted, they tend to change things. So I would really like you all to speak about travel bans, to demand that they're lifted, and I know the most difficult part will be that the Saudi authorities will tell you it's not true, because it's unofficial ones, and that we don't even know where the decision comes from. But I think that the first step is really to publicly state that we've heard about travel bans, and investigate these travel bans and lift them also. So this was my demand for today, and I really hope travel bans will be lifted sometime soon, and that it will definitely lead to a more transparent state.
Lina, thank you very much for that. I think so very often we underestimate how much impact there is on family members who are perhaps less in the limelight, and I think it's a very important thing that you raise it, and we in our role as supporting human rights defenders wherever they are should also not forget the impact that these measures have on family members. So thank you very much for sharing with that. Loujain has wisely been quiet and should probably stay quiet. She's not the only human rights defender to come out of prison and it be documented that they've closed down their social media and other forms of communication. But I'll thank you. I'll thank you for that. I'd like to now turn to our last speaker, Dana Ahmed from Amnesty International, who will speak a little bit to more immediate updates. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, Lina, and Josh. I'm going to touch upon a few issues that Lina and Josh have already discussed, but also expand on the overall human rights situation, which we've recently documented. We have documented in the past few months the continued detention, prosecution of human rights defenders, and the use of overly broad laws to legitimize such targeting of peaceful expression and activism by way of unfair trials and the continued use of the death penalty. These issues raise major concerns. Since the beginning of the year, we've documented more and more cases of arbitrary detention, unfair trials, People who have been released from detention, including women human rights defenders and other human rights defenders, have been placed under travel bans and have had to sign pledges to limit their freedom of expression, which is a condition to their release. And in terms of the use of the death penalty, we have seen a sharp increase since last year, actually, in the use of the death penalty, and a continuation in the use of the death penalty in cases that are not punishable by death under Sharia. So to start with the detention and prosecution of human rights defenders, after the G20 ended in November 2020, we have been monitoring, but we have documented more cases of people who were finally sentenced after years of being on trial before the Specialized Criminal Court. For the past 10 years, we have documented cases of human rights defenders sentenced before this court. However, in 2020, we saw a lull in such prosecutions where human rights defenders who were previously on trial before this court were just continued to be on trial to no end. However, in the beginning of 2021, we've documented at least 5 cases of human rights defenders who were sentenced between 6 and 20 years in prison before the same court. And in one of the cases that Josh has mentioned, in the case of Abdurrahman Sathan, both the counter-terror law and the cybercrime law were used in his case. And the dossier of evidence that the prosecution has showed is based on his tweets. So his tweets were cited in his charges as expression that has violated the cybercrime and counter-terror law. We have on previous occasions before the Human Rights Council, before the UPR, and before many different mechanisms raised these laws as especially concerning because they have been used again and again in cases of human rights defenders who have merely expressed opinions, dissent, sarcasm, have shared photos, and these are things that are directly cited in their charges as a violation of these laws. Of course, this is under international law, shouldn't be even a criminal offense to share photos or express anything online. Yet these laws, in some cases, explicitly criminalize expression, and in other cases are used to criminalize expression and sentence people to 6 to 20 years in prison. Other than these 2 laws, one other law has also been used to target human rights defenders, that being the law on associations. In recent months, since the beginning of this year, actually, there is one human rights defender who was initially sentenced to 14 years in prison for setting up a human rights organization. In December and then later in March 2021, his sentence was increased by 3 years. So he is now serving 17 years in prison for his work and starting a human rights organization, and then later trying to seek political asylum abroad as his case was ongoing. His name is Mohammed Al-Otaibi. This human rights defender has already faced an unfair trial and charges based on him founding a human rights organization with other individuals. Now, in Saudi Arabia, this law on associations actually restricts people's right to start a human rights organization. And it's used to prohibit people from submitting such applications to start a human rights organization. And then once they don't get their organization registered, because the law doesn't allow it, they're charged for starting an unlicensed organization. So the law does not protect anyone who wants to start a human rights organization. Contrarily, it stops people from registering legally their human rights organizations. And of course, this perpetuates more violations on civil society who are unable to institutionalize their work in the country. One other thing I'd like to expand on is the use of the death penalty. So we have seen in 2020 a sharp decrease, a drop in the number of executions, up to 85% from 2019. However, as of this year, executions have resumed as normal. Beyond the exception on executions for drug-related crimes, other executions for other crimes have continued, such as murder, terrorism, and in some cases, participation in protests. So we know that the authorities have announced a moratorium on executions for drug-related crimes. We have not seen that officially, as Josh has also said. But we have also seen that there is a continuation as usual in their executions for any other crimes. This is alarming, particularly in cases we've documented of people being executed following grossly unfair trials and following allegations of torture used to extract their confessions. This year, Mustafa Darwish, a young man, was executed under such circumstances and following an unfair trial. So if the authorities are serious about death penalty reforms, they should start with ending executions after unfair trials, publishing the moratorium on executions for drug-related crimes, and amending relevant laws to show that their legal code supports such announcements of reforms, towards, of course, with a view to end the death penalty completely, to end the use of the death penalty. One last thing I wanted to say, expanding on Lina's experience with travel bans. As we've seen, many human rights defenders, including women, were released earlier this year. We're expecting more releases of human rights defenders who have served their sentences, because some have already been released earlier this year. So we are hoping that all human rights defenders will be released in due course who have finished serving their sentences. However, the issue of travel bans perpetuates violations to their rights. So it is not only not allowing them to move, to see their families, to travel abroad, to start a life elsewhere, but it restricts their freedoms in terms of starting a new life, in terms of continuing their human rights work. And this is something that leads to violations on other terms. So people who have been recently released are now silenced because of such travel bans and pledges and conditions to their release. So these travel bans, both the judicial travel bans and the arbitrary travel bans that have no legal basis targeting families, should all be revoked. Human rights defenders should not be subject to any of these bans. It restricts their freedom of expression and movement. And that's one of the main things that we're seeing with recent releases that should be addressed as a matter of urgency, because it's not enough to release human rights defenders. They should be able to, they should be free, and they should be able to carry out their work and travel wherever they want. I'll end it here, and we can address anything else with questions.
Dana, thank you very much for that update. And I think between the UPR picture, between Lina's picture of what it's the impact on human rights defenders and their families, and Dana's update on more recent activity, I think we've got a very good picture. Thank you very much. I'm going to open the floor to questions, and I would just ask that people just write in the chat if they just want to ask the question. They don't have to write the question in the chat, but just to signal that they would like to speak, and I'll give you the floor. I also noticed that the Saudi Saudi mission has just joined us recently, and if they have and if they would like to take the floor, of course, we'd be happy to hear from them as well. So I will just open the floor now to whoever would like to ask a question. I will leave a few moments for people to think a little bit about the questions they want, but I have one question that I will ask Josh. Josh, you mentioned that you would like to see a mechanism, a monitoring mechanism for Saudi Arabia, and I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit for us, please, and just give some detail on how you envision that.
Sure, thanks, Michael. And I suppose it's something that's been raised for a number of years now from NGOs, including ourselves and Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, GCHR, and essentially would involve the establishment of a UN mechanism established to monitor the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia, in addition to the UPR, which is only every 5 years. And I guess this could take different formats, could be country-specific mandate, like we have on 11 countries at the moment, such as Iran and Syria and Somalia. And I think this is probably something that's merited on Saudi Arabia, but is also something that involves quite a lot of capacity. And so there are other forms of reporting mechanisms, and others might be best placed to discuss the details, but there are other sort of monitoring mechanisms there available that would essentially, I think the key thing is provides accountability and some form of ongoing and regular assessment of progress made. And in the context of these three statements at the Human Rights Council that you mentioned in the last 2 years from Iceland, Denmark and Australia, which have in the immediate aftermath led to some concessions, such as provisional release of some defenders, but then not been sustained because they're just one-off and require quite a bit of coordination from states. And so in this context, and given the pace of violations that we now see, and which Dana and Lina have outlined, I think it really makes it very pressing that there is this type of mechanism, and why it's good that we're here today, which can hopefully provide a platform for this to be brought into effect at the next and upcoming human rights sessions.
Great, thank you very much for that, Joshua. That's gotten us going. I see a couple of hands up for questions. First, there's Saeed, who just is listed as Saeed's phone, and after that, the U.S. mission. So I'll invite Saeed to ask your question, please. And if you choose to introduce yourself, that would be nice.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. My name is Saeed Ibrahimi. I'm from Afghanistan. I don't know a lot about Saudi Arabia, but I have an interest in human rights and what's going on in the Middle East. It's also having an impact on us in Afghanistan. So my question was from the panel. Anybody who would like to answer is a much more practical question. People who are under house arrest or people who are in danger, what are like some practical solutions to get them out of Saudi Arabia? Right now in Afghanistan, the United States managed to get out more than 100,000 Afghans whose lives were in danger. The European Union and others also chipped in and helped in. And it'll be a continuous project where people who are at risk, they would find ways to leave the country, basically. Ideally, they should be allowed to stay there to promote human rights, to promote democracy. But I'm just talking about Afghanistan, the Afghanistan experience. Right now, none of those might be a possibility under the Taliban regime, which kind of resembles the Saudi regime. So, and in the light of the Biden administration's focus on human rights, what are like some practical solutions that that could be, put in place by the U.S., by the current administration, by the European Union, by Amnesty International and other organizations to actually help people out I'm hearing like lots of people are in jails, lots of people are under house arrest, they can't move. I mean, we are facing the same issues in Afghanistan, but people are finding ways to move to, even like borders are closed right now in Afghanistan, but people are even using, different means to leave.
I think we get a sense of your question, and I'm also conscious of time. So I think your question is what can be done to help that? And I see Lina has put her hand up, so maybe you'd like to answer, and then I'll leave it to either of the other panelists who might want to complete that.
Yes, I will be brief, and I will say I'm not an expert, but I have experienced it, and it was so difficult for us to, have any information when my sister was in prison. And throughout these years, I've met so many people who, whose siblings were disappeared, forcibly disappeared, or imprisoned, or tortured, or whatever. And what we see is that given the present actual Saudi regime, public pressure works. So, this is what and I know some diplomats always think that, we have to balance between private and public pressure, which I agree, of course, I'm not trying to challenge anything, but what I'm saying is that Saudi Arabia really cares about its image. It doesn't really care about what is going on inside of the country. MBS wants, so the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia wants to make sure he can stay on the throne. So he has to have a good image for his legitimacy. And so he wants to hide everything that is going on. So the only thing that works is pressuring him, telling him, we know what is going on inside of the country, even though you're trying to hide it by, for example, making travel bans unofficial or illegally made so that no one can even have evidence of it. So pressure every time, any country has relations with Saudi Arabia, telling them that they know what is going on and that they won't go back to business as usual as long as X, Y, and Z violations are not cleared, and that it's not possible for them to accept having normal relations with a country that treats its people like this.
Thank you very much, Lina. Joshua or Dana, is there something you would like to add to that? Okay, next question from the United States mission, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Great. Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank all of the organizers for putting together this very important event, and many thanks to all the speakers, especially Lina, for raising awareness of ongoing restrictions on human rights defenders in Saudi Arabia. And on behalf of the U.S. government, our sincere condolences to Joshua for the recent death of your executive director. As President Biden has said, the United States is recalibrating our relationship with Saudi Arabia to align with our values, including respect for fundamental freedoms. Exercising freedom of speech should never be criminalized. We'd like to thank the panelists today for discussing the issue of post-release probationary measures, and would greatly appreciate if you could elaborate a little more on the prospects for Saudi Arabia lifting post-release probationary measures on activists such as asset freeze and the travel bans that you've touched on today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. What I'll leave. Okay, I see Lina has her hand up, so maybe you go first, and we'll see if the other panelists want to join in after.
Actually, my hand up was the previous question. So if someone else wants to speak, otherwise I can also give my impression.
Go ahead, go ahead, Lina, and we'll see if Josh and Dana want to add after.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, the question is, what do we expect now? I will tell you honestly. I mean, for example, for us at the beginning, no one really believed that we could save these activists from prison. Everyone thought that they would be sentenced to 20 years at least, or to the death penalty, because that's how it seemed. So I think that everything depends on how much we pressure Saudi Arabia and how much we tell them that we know what is going on. So when I I'm taking risk talking about my family being under travel ban because no one is supposed to know it, and that their aim is to silence everyone. So I think that if we pressure them and that we make it clear that everyone knows about these travel bans, that they're illegal, they're unjust, they're not fair, then we can change things rapidly, honestly. I mean, I think we just have to make it public, to be consistent in our demands, and to, you know, to keep pressuring. And I do believe pressure works. We've seen it the last 3 years. And so everything will, you know, depend on how everyone reacts to what the Saudis say and their testimonies.
Thank you, Lina. Josh or Dana, would you like to add to that? Dana?
Thank you, Lina. Just to add that travel bans that human rights defenders face are judicially imposed, so they are prescribed in their sentences. And oftentimes the sentence also prescribes a punishment related to the use of social media or appearing on media or continuing their writing and work. So verdicts are very specific and also punishing human rights defenders after their release. Given that these verdicts are final, and as we saw with many cases of human rights defenders, the only way to influence change politically, because once the judicial system has imposed these verdicts and these sentences have been upheld, there is no way to have any kind of influence except directly through the executive branch of the government, which is politically. So in cases of human rights defenders released and who are now on travel bans and who are now not speaking out because of the conditions to their release, the pressure needs to be direct and public to the Saudi authorities about this, because there is no way that we can influence this through a process, because these are final decisions and these are prescribed in the verdicts of human rights defenders.
Thank you, Dana. Josh, anything to add?
I think mostly been covered. Just to highlight, I guess, the importance of keeping the pressure up, and this is a theme, as Dana highlighted and Lina, that we're likely to see more of, as some prisoners of conscience who have been detained for many years are due to be released in the upcoming years. And I think it's key the sort of language you use around this, and making sure to use words like provisional and to highlight these restrictions, because in the past I've sometimes seen some diplomats or other people in the fields kind of indicate that these releases are total. So just highlighting these restrictions, and I think more can be done to highlight this theme and its implications for people in other countries as well, and family members.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Josh. Okay, next on the list of questions, Denmark, please. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. And thank you very much to the organizers for putting up this event. It has been very interesting to hear from you all. I would like to ask if the panelists could kindly elaborate on the situation and developments in regard to women and girls' rights related to male guardianship. Of course, we know there have been some developments, but what do you view as the main challenges that probably still are there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I don't know who would like to jump into that first. I'm sure all three have something to say.
I can start, and maybe Lina and Josh can add. I'll talk about one aspect in relation to women's rights. We've seen promises earlier this year from the authorities, actually directly from the Crown Prince, that more legislative reforms will be announced this year, including a new personal status law or a family law, which of course codifies laws, regulations related to women and marriage, divorce, inheritance, child custody, and other family issues. Up until this point, and till now actually, because this law has not yet been passed, these issues have been regulated through the discretion of judges or courts, because there's no codified way to enforce such issues and to protect women's rights. So one important thing in relation to women's rights so far is on these issues, and we need to see a law in order to really uphold the women's rights reforms that are promised or announced. We need to see a law that is in line with international standards, that protects women's rights in these areas of marriage, divorce, child custody, and inheritance, and that does not enable discrimination in these areas. Because as of this point, there is still no law or a codified way to regulate these issues. So that's one aspect of the guardianship system that we've yet to see some changes on. We've heard promises, but so far we haven't seen the law, and it has not been published. So that's something to anticipate.
Anything to Lina? Go ahead,
Yes.
please.
Harry, can I just add also, again, Saudi Arabia is becoming a police state, so we really have to be careful when we hear about so-called reforms. The reforms that were mostly applauded in the West was the fact that women could drive, and we saw that the very women who have been asking for it got imprisoned and tortured for it. The second decision or reform was the fact that women could travel without the consent of their male guardian. But again, it doesn't, journalists mostly have not digged really deep into this issue, and nobody really talks about the disobedience law, which basically gives total control over a woman by the male guardian. So even if a woman, for example, travels, and if she gets back, he can just say that she was disobedient, and she can get imprisoned. And not only will she get imprisoned, she will get imprisoned and won't be able to leave the care home, which is basically a prison, without the consent of this very male guardian who decided to put her in this prison. So we see that the infrastructure of women's rights is still as bad, that the reforms the Saudis brag about are merely for their own image and not for the sake of really human rights and improving women's rights in the country. And another thing we see is the, I don't know if it's the increase, but there's a lot, I hear a lot about of women victims of domestic violence, and still nothing is done to protect them. Not only they don't protect them, but also they protect the male guardians who violate women's rights. So I would say nothing really changed when it comes to women's rights. What has changed is mainly the context in Saudi Arabia. Of course, women can now, go to restaurants with men. They can go to concerts. They can go, but it's only it's not deep. It's not structural. It's not. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. And so we see that the changes don't really change the situation of women whose male guardian is basically a bad man. And if you have a bad male guardian, he can do anything to you.
Thank you, Lina. I'm going to I'm going to reopen the floor to questions to see if there are any further questions for any of our panelists. Okay, thank you very much. We have a few moments left, so I'm just going to give the panelists maybe 1 or 2 minutes to just give us an idea of the direction, perhaps that you see Saudi Arabia going. We've talked about the sort of the pause during the COVID period, and then unfortunately pressure on human rights defenders intensifying. But perhaps you can just give us a sense of where what the overall direction is in whichever areas that you care to speak on. And I'll open that up to the other three unless there are any last questions. I don't see any, so I'll just open that up to any of the three panelists.
I can maybe start. I will say, as I usually say, is that the regime, so MBS, is who he is and he won't change. The thing is that we can make things change because he can be paralyzed a bit in his position. But if nobody does anything, if no one talks, if no one pressures him, then we're going, the wrong way. Saudi Arabia will be more repressive. There will be more prisoners of conscience, more torture, more journalists cut into pieces. So it all depends on how the allies pressure the Saudi regime. I think that it can go the right way if civil society inside the country are allowed to talk and they're not muzzled anymore. And this will only be possible if Saudi Arabia's allies outside of the country pressure them to make change inside of the country. So I call on everyone who listens to really know that their pressure, their voices matter, that MBS is nothing without the West's support, that they have a leverage over this, and that civil society in Saudi Arabia is now non-existent. Everyone is silenced, and we need our brave voices again to change and to make Saudi Arabia go towards the right path again.
Thank you very much, Lina. Josh or Dana?
Maybe just to reiterate Lina's point of, MBS is not going to change. And looking back at the previous UPR of Saudi Arabia, the second cycle, likewise, it made a lot of recommendations, but we had the same question of these not being implemented. And so we can't expect different results, or we can't accept the Saudi authorities at their face value or by their announcements or making reforms. We have to really dig deeper and follow up with coordinated efforts to follow up and ensure accountability. So it's now really on us, and we know the pace of violation has now resumed. So maybe this year started on a slightly more optimistic tone given the G20 and COVID and things like that, but now we're really seeing a renewed crackdown and sentences today, like the upholding of the 20-year sentence against Abdurrahman al-Sadhan really highlights this, that now we really have to, now is the time to really raise spotlight on this with action at the UN and by other member states. So I'd say that is really a key thing going forwards for the rest of this year and next year ahead.
Thanks, Josh.
Just to end by saying we have an opportunity, given the authorities are continuing to promise reforms, including legislative reforms related to their legal system, their criminal justice system, their system to regulate and put a framework on women's rights in the country. And so this is an opportunity to reiterate our calls for change, because these reforms are not enough when there is no civil society to input into them. Reforms on women's rights will never be meaningful when the women who have themselves been working on these issues for decades are unable to speak out or input into such reforms or monitor the situation or violations that are happening to women. So I think we have an opportunity to say that these promised reforms cannot be considered meaningful or full enough until there's civil society participation. And until women human rights defenders can input into laws, and until human rights defenders can form their own organizations. So I think we have to have a basis which starts with freedom of expression, with the release of human rights defenders, and after that we can talk about meaningful reforms, because without having an open and free civil society and a space for expression, these reforms don't mean anything. They're top down, they're done without the consultation of people and human rights defenders who have themselves been working on these issues for decades cannot input into them. So we have to have a starting call on the release of these human rights defenders and their ability to participate in reforms.
Thank you very much for that, Dana. I know there's been a lot of heavy information and heavy news to hear, but I do see one positive thread going through what all three speakers have said, which is that with enough pressure, improvements can be made. And I think I'd like to leave you with that positive thought, hopefully, and perhaps a direction for future action. I would like to thank everyone for taking time to have spent an hour with us today. I know for people working on the Human Rights Council, it's an extremely busy time, so very grateful that you could make the time, and to all the others, some of whom we know and some we don't. So thank you very much. Feel free to save the chat if you want to. I'll close the meeting here, but wait for people to leave at their own speed. Thank you very much again for participating today.
Thank you, Michael, for the great moderation, and Josh and Lina and Dana. It was really a very complimentary presentation. Thank you very much. A great overview.
Okay, thank you for those kind words. I still see a few other people, so I'm going to end the call now, and look forward to talking further with the speakers at a later moment. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye-bye.